Good morning. It's Friday the 25th of April 2025. It's a bad day out today, wet and hard to get anything done. So I just have time to make a video or two. I don't want to make too many of them. I'm joined here by Dewish. She jumps up here. She decided to be inside as well. Now you may get down there, Dewish, and don't interfere with the camera. So anyway, I have the time now to make this video on the woes of the European Union, and this is not the usual giving out. I want to explain to you why, in my opinion, and the opinion of many other observers, the European Union is in a serious problem. The name of it here is European Woes, Ukraine War Update, and the Ukraine War builds into that. Now, I hope you don't mind, it'll be probably 25 to 30 minutes. She'll have to go down. See, it's the weather. Now, many observers point to the fact that there have been many empires built up in the world, and they all seem to come to nothing. So if we look at some of them, we have the Roman Empire. Of course, well, there was one earlier in Egypt, I suppose, and there were a few like that. But there was the Roman Empire, and it was followed by the Byzantium Empire. But there was another type of empire not too many people understand, and that was the Norsemen. The Norsemen had an empire where they conquered Greenland and Iceland, but they also went to Kiev in Russia, in Ukraine, now still Ukraine, and they set up an empire there, and they established the Eastern Orthodox Church there. And a lot of the Russian tradition dates back to Norsemen who went and conquered Eastern Russia. So their empire didn't collapse as such. They just left a trademark on their blood where they went. Now, as someone else posted on an earlier video about Iceland, they said the Irish are big blood group there, and that was because of slavery. They brought the women over or whatever. I don't know. We'll not go there. Any event, the next empire, there was a French one, there was a Spanish one. The Spanish Empire mostly raided South America and Middle America and wreaked havoc there and took all they had. And they left their language all around South America. The French were in Africa and they were in Asia, in Vietnam, over that area. And they left part of their languages there yet. And their language is still in places like Burkina Faso, Mali, in Africa. They're being pushed out of there at the minute, but they had their empire, but it's collapsed. The Spanish Empire's collapsed. The Roman Empire's collapsed. Yeah, man, I wouldn't say the Norsemen's empire ever existed fully, but it maybe was more enduring the way they did it. They just married in and away they went. But anyway, the next thing was, of course, the British Empire. And the British Empire results today that the English language is being spoken and English laws are being enforced, type laws in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, United States, many islands in the Caribbean, Ireland, England, Scotland and Wales. So the English had an empire and they built it up, and it began to fade. As the Americans came up. So it looks like there's generally always a competition among these powers to keep on top, and they always like to be on top. So the British had their empire, and there was a war with them and the United States where they attempted to have one country between America and England, but that didn't work out. And about 1814 or 15, the wars ended and the British and the Americans joined up as allies. There were several engagements by the Americans in the Philippines and various things like that. They were interfered in a bit, but not too bad. The British kept on there, but eventually, anyway, the British had to let go of their grip, and the British had to appeal to the Americans then as their backup. And in the First World War, the Americans did something which was a bit strange. You had the Germans in the First World War and the British, but who's to say who was entitled to rule Europe or to have one say larger than the other? Could the Germans, which half of the German blood at that time, half of the American blood was German. So what was the big deal about keeping down the Germans? I don't fully get that. Someone shot Archduke Ferdinand. He wasn't the first and he won't be the last. But anyway, a far out relative of mine died in it, and many people died. So there you are. They had their war anyway with the keeping down the Germans, and they thought they had it solved with the Treaty of Versailles, where the British and the Americans put the gutty in, put the boot in, made them pay reparations and everything, humiliated the Germans big time. Remember, there were no concentration camps in the Kaiser's Germany. It was Wilhelm. It wasn't that bad of a place as far as I understand. But anyway, it led to the rise of Hitler, and just like the pendulum, when you go too much in one direction, you go the other way. And this is pendulum politics, and it's highly dangerous. Far better to have politics on consideration and assessment, but the human being doesn't appear to be built like that. So then you got the situation where after the war, the Americans learned from the war, and they was it Eisenhower was on the go at that time, but anyway, they learned from the war, and instead of putting reparations on Germany and Japan, they let Japan prosper industrially. With Germany, they split Germany into two areas between the Russians and the communist system and the West, but it did allow Germany to rise up industrially. So they didn't put the same crippling taxes. I don't think Germany had to pay any reparations for the Second World War. Correct me if I'm wrong. So in any event, that was all right. That continued. And the next thing is you had America trying to keep down what they believed was the scourge of communism. Now, to what degree? I don't like communism myself. But the exact origins of this hatred of Russia is something that escapes me. I'm not quite sure why they should hate Russia. I was out in South Dakota on my holidays in 1999 and changed these glasses in 1999, and there was an American farmer getting married to a Russian girl who came over on some kind of an exchange course or something, some kind of a learning thing, and she married. But plenty of Irish girls and fellas went over and married Americans. So I don't know if they didn't have this hatred of the Russians, we might have more interrelationships between us. They don't seem that bad to me. The few of them I know seem to be all right. Anyway, that's only my opinion. But the next thing was there was this antipathy towards the Russians. But the Americans went to unbelievable effort to keep down communism with the aid of the British too, and the French and the Canadians. And one of the things they did was the Vietnam War. 54,000 troops were killed alone. That's not the injured. So they were getting into Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam, places that the Americans never heard of. The young lads going off to fight never heard of such a place. And they lost there. They got beaten. And then they started getting involved in Afghanistan after the Russians were beaten. The Russians were beaten out of it, and they go into it. They were beaten out of it again. They had to go anyway. So then they started to interfere in Georgia, in south of Russia, and tried to instill an anti-Russian regime in that area, using Victoria Nuland, the extreme right-wing one there for that. And they tried the same in the African countries ruled by France. She was run out of it. That didn't work. But they were trying to do it. But the biggest example of all, of course, is the Ukraine. And it has to be said that while the European Union and the British probably wouldn't have went to the same extent with Ukraine, but the Americans intended one thing. Yanukovych was the president in 2014, and he knew to stay neutral. He kept in with all sides, which is the eventual result after 1 million people being killed. Victoria Nuland went over and distributed sweets to them to try and invoke a colour revolution. At the time, the earlier pre-2014 administration tried to live and let live, tried to have good relationships between Russian-speaking people and Ukrainians, and there were a group of very, very intense Nazis in Ukraine, extreme Hitler lovers, and they wanted nothing to do with the Russians. They wanted them out, and there was a lot of heavy fighting there during the Second World War. So, in any event, what happened next was American and maybe to a lesser extent European and British big interests decided to grab all the goods in Ukraine, grab it for commercial purposes. They have this model that a company always has to have growth, there always has to be an expansion. So surely if there's an expansion, it has to be at someone else's expense. That's their model, and they were going for that with BlackRock Development and Vanguard and all of these. They saw Ukraine as a prime profit-making enterprise so they could become super rich. And they had this idea that the Russians never can do anything right. They always make a hames of it. And there is evidence for that in many parts of Russia. Their communist revolution was a mad thing. It was mad, but that's gone. That's gone since 1991. And Mr. Gorbachev, the Russian prime minister or leader at the time, was promised that there'd be no expansion of NATO. Anyway, the West decided, with the blessing of the European Union, which is not a proper state at all, and with NATO, that they'd keep pushing in and surround Russia. They'd surround Russia in Ukraine, and they'd surround Russia in Belarus if they could, and they'd surround Russia in Georgia. Now, they did take the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and they created them into NATO. And they are in the front line there. And maybe if you were to be honest about it, maybe the Russians would invade there if they got. But it was a different story altogether to go to bringing NATO into Ukraine and into Georgia. Russia could not tolerate that. Russia had to create a war, and if necessary, a third world war to prevent it. There was no option there from any realistic, sensible point of view. Are you with me so far? Now, so the EU was gung-ho with America. They were all the one. And in 2014, the revolution took place and left the Russians in a minority in a very vulnerable position. And in Odessa, they murdered an awful lot of them. And even to this day, Zelensky has no apology for murdering Russians. He has no time for them, and that's it. Kill them, and that's it. So what happened next then was Putin took over the Crimea, and he says he'd done a poll in it and that they voted to come into Russia. I don't know if that's right. I wouldn't just bet me bottom dollar on that, but I'd say that probably a good lot of Russians there anyway. And it's the kind of the holiday resort of Russia, and so he grabbed it and he took it. Now, that should have been alarm bells. And there was 2 years between 2014 and 2016 when Obama was in control. But they did nothing. And maybe if they did, there would have been a world war. But certainly it was a declaration of intent, and everybody should have realised, whatever about the Crimea, we have to watch the rest of Ukraine. Because Putin was talking about it all the time, and his ministers were giving out about what was happening. Now, why did America not act? Well, remember that in the middle of all of this anti-communism American push and European push, Cuba was set up on the very outskirts of Florida, 90 miles from Key West in Florida. And America could do nothing about Cuba. They didn't feel up to it. I never could understand, was it the president of Kennedy or what? But there were other presidents that they didn't say, right, Cuba's a small thing. Even when the Russian Empire collapsed, why did America not invade Cuba? Anyone might like to tell me that. But I mean, these are people that invaded Afghanistan, Vietnam, and here they have a country just out the road, and they let Castro continue. And they had the biggest army in the world, and the only opposition was the Russians, and they were gone. So that's one for debate underneath. Were they afraid? I don't know. I'd say the Americans would have won in that place, and a lot of the Cubans would back the Americans too. Anyway, it didn't happen. So is there a weakness there on behalf of America? I don't know. Any event, we'll skip on from that. And the next thing was Donald Trump got in. And in fairness to Donald Trump or against him, he should have had negotiations about it. There was, after all, an invasion of the Crimea. There was an invasion of the Crimea. Maybe he should have been talking. But then again, his opponents said he was involved in Russian collusion. And if he got involved with talking to the Russians, they'd accuse him of more Russian collusion. They tried to impeach him. They tried to put him out. So how is he supposed to deal with this Crimean situation when his own position was in threat. They tried to prosecute him, they tried to do everything. They gave him no support, and his own party only gave him lackluster support. So the likes of Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi tearing up his State of the Union speech, and Chuck Schumer and AOC Cortez, they have a lot to answer for, because it is possible that if Trump had to be left alone, he might have got going with negotiations. He just couldn't deal with this level of pressure to put him out with no reason given. Moreover, if he did try to reach out to the Russians, he was going to be blamed on Radio Television in Ireland and the BBC as a Russian collusion artist in the White House. So this is what they have to answer for. Now, the next thing is nothing was done and Trump was put out by fair means or foul. YouTube will ban me if I tell you why I think fair means or foul, and was put out in 2020. And the climate change was flying. Everything was climate change. And the next thing, the pandemic came in, and YouTube will be putting posters here and all about it, telling us who the United Nations is. And the pandemic came in, and that was a big thing. Even before, while Trump was there, it was a big thing to handle, in fairness, rightly or wrongly. And it was a big thing for Biden to handle as well. But as it began to wind down, there was still an opportunity to see what could be done. But efforts to bring peace, and even Zelensky began to learn when he saw the Russian tanks coming, maybe we're better do something. This is not the first time Russia rolled into these countries. They rolled into, Czechoslovakia. It was 1968, and Prague Spring, and all of this, and Warsaw. They've been rolling into these countries for years. And Zelensky, I think he began to have second thoughts. And if he had to get any support, he might have tried to see what could be done. But no, Boris Johnson flew over and told him no. And Victoria Nuland, no, stick to your guns. We'll back you to the hilt. So then you had the situation where the geopolitical situation in Europe was America and Europe, and the EU was like that. The EU was extremely woke. The men were boxing the women in the Olympic Games, knocking their teeth out, and there was all this LGBTQ and all this stuff, and jailing people for speaking their minds and all of this. And there was people complained all over Europe, but they were mostly put in jail or banned or kept out. And if they won elections, they weren't allowed to become the politicians, as happened in the case of Geert Wilders. Anyway, we moved from that, but they couldn't have that luck every place. So in the United States, there's a different voting system, and the American people simply saw the mess that Biden was making. He wasn't awake half the time. You can say all you like about him, you know my feelings on him, but they saw the mess was making. And when Trump managed to get back in again, he hit it very lucky. When he got back in again, that the judicial system was doing its best to destroy him, but they couldn't really, the way he got elected and all of that. So he did get support from his own party. But the point about it is, you have the whole European Union with a complete woke grip, a complete anti-Russian grip, complete pro-Zelensky grip, and you had half of America, maybe 46%, all for the Democrats. They would still be looking for war. The Irish in America, a lot of them vote, 3/4 vote Democrat. The Irish in America are warmongers. They love war. They gloat on war. And if their own children are killed, they love to get in the medal and look at this medal. And they never equate, well, that's my son that's gone. He's gone. Oh, no. Oh, look, he got a medal. You see, this is the way the Irish in America think. But most of them now, not them all. I knew great patriots who hate the migration into Ireland, Irish Americans, and they still hate Trump. But to make a long story short, the whole cozy arrangement was taking place. Everything was set up with America and Europe, and they were in gear to give it to Russia and keep at him. And they imposed all these sanctions. They sanctioned and sanctioned. And meanwhile, their own green stuff was destroying their industry. And then they sanctioned more, and they cut off grass, and they've done all. And their own economy suffered much more than Russia. And Putin is clever, and he thinks ways out of these things that other people wouldn't, and he was able to sell his fuel to India, and they sold it back to the EU, and the EU was happy with that, and they're a lying organisation anyway, but they don't want to admit it. Okay. The next thing is what happened with the lovely alliance. NATO was an alliance led by America. America was absorbing the unbalance of the trade. America was paying off essentially Europe, because Europe could export into America, but when America tried to export into them, they clapped big tariffs on them. So did Canada. And Trump seen through this, and he just decided, this is not on, the same as I'd do if somebody was stealing me silage and not pay me for it. I might let them have a bill or two, but after that, I'd expect a few pound, and you'd lock the gate. So it's the very same thing in that with that. So the West thought they were going to beat the Russians. They thought they had an alliance with America and all this. And the Ireland is a neutral country, and yet it's in this war. And Austria is a neutral country, and it's in this war. And they're all never joined NATO. They're supposed to be neutral, and they're all actually de facto part, sort of NATO in a way. So anyway, the next thing was they seized Russia's assets with Biden. And the amount, it varies, but the best amount I can get is 260 billion euros, and it's nearly $300 billion. That's the amount of money seized by America with the collusion or the agreement of the Europeans of Russian assets that were invested there. Now, why Russia had its money there when they were going to do this is something I don't know. It does, in my opinion, it's something that wouldn't happen. Val Martin, I can tell you, I'd have it out. I'd have gone out of there. But that's what happened anyway. So they took this money. It's not fully taken. But what the European Union did then was they gave loans to Ukraine. They guaranteed loans to Ukraine, collected in many places, including America. They guaranteed to those loans and to act as collateral or a signature for them. And they promised that if it all came to all and things got tough, they'd use the Russian money to pay those loans. Now, just to explain that again, the Ukrainians wanted cash. The Europeans gave guaranteed loans. So no matter who the money came in from, the Europeans guaranteed it. 260 billion euros. With me on that? They guaranteed it. Now, the Americans put a block. They froze those assets. And the European Union assumed that that money would become available. If the Ukraine won the war, well then they might be in a position to pay back. But they weren't going to let them down. So then the next thing is that something unusual happened. This ally of Europe's and of Ukraine's, with President Trump at the helm, started imposing tariffs on Europe. Mr. Trump began to claim Greenland, which, although in the American plate, is part and ruled by Denmark and is a Denmark possession. So Mr. Trump is promising to he's not promising, but he's saying about it, to invade to invade Greenland. And Jeffrey Sachs is a very eminent commentator. He's a very good thinking man, but he's not always right, but he's good at this. He says there is a possibility that before Trump goes out of office, he'll invade Greenland. And take it over. Now, that is some prospect for the EU to think about, but I don't think he will. But it puts the European Union in some position where you have America threatening part of their territory. And right enough, should Greenland be in the possession of the European Union? Because Ursula von der Leyen can tell Denmark what to do with it. You do this and do that. Is that right? Well, that's the way it is. Don't tell me that she can't. She can tell the Irish government exactly what to do. And they do it. And she can tell the British government what to do. So they're now in this position. Now, that then has to be looked at in the context of Trump doing something that the Europeans nearly died over. They never talked to Russia. They never had the brains or the smartness to appoint one person. They could have appointed some neutral person, not say who, as a negotiator between the EU and Russia. Throw him a few pounds, throw him a little bit of money. Anyone that has an international reputation. Of course, they probably wouldn't be able to pick him. But they could have picked some of these famous people who were of good standard. But then it'd probably be Klaus Schwab or somebody who's not of good standard. So what happened then was they didn't pick anyone. Trump lifted the phone and spoke to Russia, and the EU blew a fuse. And now Trump is pushing for some kind of a peace deal with Russia, and the EU won't have it. Zelensky said, no, I want everything or nothing. I want back to pre-2014 borders. I want it all sorted. And that, of course, is not on the cards at all. So that means that he's vetoing any efforts by President Trump, who wants to get this settled and move on. There's bigger fish to fry. Meanwhile, the war is over. Trump is asking Putin not to go so hard, not to kill so many. And that is what I'd expect him to do. It's what I'd do as well, for God's sake. You have it sort of one, sure, what's the point in doing this? I think there'll be no more spring offensives. There'll be no more American weapons supplied. There'll be very little European weapons because they don't have them in any event. And I think you're going to just see the Ukraine just settling down into its poverty. And they can do what they like. They're not going to win. Now, this brings the point of them paying back the money. And they will not pay back €1 because they haven't got it anyway. They wouldn't pay it anyway. And half it's gone. So now the Europeans are in this position. And they wanted the Americans to seize Russian assets, and when push come to shove, to seize them and take them off Russia. €260 billion, and to give it to them to bail out the Ukrainians. But Trump is on the phone to Putin, and as part of any negotiations will be the legal position regarding that. If the Americans back the Europeans in a fight in the courts, big time, we're not giving you back your money, that would mean Putin would probably not manage to get it in any court, because there'd be this court and that court, and the judges would be all appointed by the West anyway, and he probably would not get it. But if Trump releases a bit, all Trump has to do is not contest it. So the EU will go in with the lawyers into the American court, and the judges say, where's the American government? We're not taking interest. We don't mind. The judge then will have to rule in accordance with the law and order the money that's seized in American accounts to be handed back to Russia. And the Ukraine will have got its money. The EU will now be facing this money that they're expecting never to be paid. So the EU has now given out €260 billion, €1,000,000,000, gone down the drain, nothing to show for it. And when they go to look for the money, the Russian money to be paid to them, to compensate them, America won't back them. And so all the indications are that the courts will rule that it's Russians' money. And there's a lot of international law, and if the courts rules it's Russian money, whatever happens to it, the Ukraine won't be getting it. And this is the huge dilemma facing the European Union. Europe's woes. The thing has changed entirely. In actual fact, the reliance on NATO with America in charge is highly dubious. And there's another 3 years in Trump's period. It's highly unlikely that a president will be re-elected in America again that will reverse and go back to the woke agenda. Highly unlikely that the American people will vote for that. It never had common support. Okay, California and New York might still vote for AOC Cortez. But it's monumental. There's a Christine Anderson. She's an alternative for Deutschland, MEP, I think she is, And she explains this, and she does it very well. They're a mad crowd of villains. I'm keeping my personal view out of it. But just look at the stew they're in. And you have Sir Keir Starmer. Oh, he's going to put boots on the ground. His army wouldn't fill Wembley Stadium. Wouldn't fill a football stadium. Wouldn't fill Old Trafford. And he's going to get very few, in my opinion, to join up and fight for that nonsense. And it's the same all over. Georgina Maloney has met Donald Trump. She met him in New York, and you may know well, relations are cordial. There's a big move now within Europe to handle this hungry man, Viktor Orban. And he's blocking, because of the veto, any more payment or any more sanctions on Russia and stopping gas. He's relying on the gas coming in from Russia. So the splits are there. My job, folks, is not to give you my opinion. My job is to explain these are the pressures that's now on. And this goes right down to farm payments in Ireland, to EU structural funds. Because that was all coming of German manufacturing, Dutch manufacturing. Look at all your haymaking machinery. It was all made in Holland, as far as I know, or Belgium, Ziegers and all these. And they're all virtually closed because they can't go on. The car manufacturing business is in tatters, and they're thinking of making tanks. And if they're making weapons of war, where's the money going to come from? If they made a car and sold it to me or you, we buy the car, and that's money for them. But if they can't get us to buy the car, what are they going to do? They're going to wait till we have some few bob left to buy a car, and they'll seize it on us. But now, I hope now on 31 minutes I've explained that fairly good to you, and this huge dilemma that they're in. You won't get this on mainstream media. That is the view of many. That is the view of many economists. It doesn't mean everything Trump is doing will work for him. It mightn't, it might not. But the one thing for sure, it's very, very doubtful, and you need to watch for this. Will the Trump administration agree to take Russia's money? In the end of the day, it's belonging to Russia. It was invested in America. If they take it, what's that going to do for the ability of America to get loans again if they do that? Sure, if you dirty your copy, you're like Stubbs Gazette in Ireland. You're no longer a credit-worthy state. Now, thank you very much for that. I hope you enjoyed that, and that's well thought out. I have well researched. That's the situation. What they're going to do now is big. We know in Ireland they'll vote for Ursula in Ireland. Oh man dear, and the British will vote for Starmer. They'll put him in again. But they can do what they like. But the bottom line of this is poverty, poverty, poverty. There's elections coming up in Britain, I think the 1st of May. I might deal with them separately. I'll not say too much here because I haven't them researched. Folks, comment underneath. What do you think? Isn't that really the situation? Isn't this madness in Europe coming to a head? And the one thing Henry Kissenger said, to be America's enemy is dangerous, to be America's friend is lethal. Remember, although the EU did help or were anti-Russian, it was America's connivance interfering in countries that brought about the Ukrainian situation. It wasn't an EU official was in what the Maidan, isn't that what you call it? At the time of the revolution, giving out sweets. It was Victoria Nuland. They were trying it recently in Georgia. They're trying it everywhere. So from Putin's point of view, they are constantly trying to undermine Russia and destroy its security. It was the Americans was doing it. But the Americans that were doing it are only supported by about 47% of those who vote. And there's still 53%, roughly, don't hold me to it, of those who vote are not for this taking over land all over the place, taking over Gaddafi, killing him, moving in everywhere. That day, Trump has said, we'll end these foreign wars. And so Trump is elected on a stopping wars agenda. So really, Europe's woes are American organised. In that if there was a level-headed, standard, honest government in America, Ukraine would still have its original prime minister, and there would be protections for Russians, and you might still have a full-sized with the Crimea, Ukraine. It's America did it. And America was Europe's friend, And what did Henry Kissinger say? To be their enemy is dangerous, but now Trump and Putin is trying to sort out something, but to be their friend is lethal. And now Europe is left holding the bill. Europe is left holding the mess because they didn't have the character to think it out for themselves and have an independent policy. Thank you very much. We'll see you back soon on this, what day did I say it was? 25th of April. I hope I'm writing that in Ireland. Good luck. Bye.